on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome Dave Zirin. He is the Nation magazine sports editor, author of Game Over, How Politics Has Turned the Sports World Upside Down, and author of the forthcoming Brazil's Dance with the Devil about the World Cup. Welcome to the program, Dave.
Great to be here, Sam. The only problem is I have no idea what we're going to talk about for the next 20 minutes.
Oh, well, I want to talk about Sochi. I want to talk about Michael Sam, and I want to talk about these stories of unionization that are sort of starting to bubble up in college sports.
Yeah, I was being sarcastic. I mean, it's actually, I'm overwhelmed with the amount of sports politics stories coming down the pike these days.
That was the first thing I was going to say to you. It's like, it has been unbelievable. We have talked in the past, and one of the things that I love about your writing is that it reveals to people the sort of inherent politics that are taking place in sports that I think people don't first recognize. And over the past month, it has been the amount of politics in sports, and maybe a little longer, has been so explicit, ranging from both social issues and economic issues, that it's been stunning. And I think, frankly, when I see a tweet about, John Elway complaining about handouts and somebody coming back with, why doesn't somebody ask him about the subsidies, his football stadium has gotten, I really think to a large extent that is because of the writing that you've been doing over the years, because I don't see anybody else out there making those connections. But what's going on? Is there something in the water or what?
Yeah, no, I think we've hit a perfect storm on a whole bunch of issues. And with social media, which of course allows for a kind of direct backtalk of us lonely peons to the people on high in the sports establishment, that's created even more of a kind of explicit dialogue. But you're talking about a lot of different issues that have come together all at once. And I would argue that it all spins around the Sochi Olympics, because one of the things about the Sochi Games, because Russia is right now at loggerheads with the United States for all sorts of reasons, it's opened up a lot of official criticism about Russia, about Putin, but also about issues like homophobia in the Olympics. And once you start talking about that, then it becomes a discussion that becomes much more difficult for kind of the media powers that be to control. It's a much more difficult discussion to control. So it's like, okay, well, if we're going to talk about homophobia in the Olympics, let's talk about homophobia in U.S. sports right here. If we're going to talk about corporate cronyism and corruption in the $50 billion Olympics, let's talk about all the cronyism and corruption that took place around the Super Bowl in New York and New Jersey last month. If we're going to talk, so many issues. If we're going to talk about amateurism and the idea of what happens to these athletes, how do they subsist when they're not at the Olympics themselves, then let's talk about amateurism with regards to the NCAA. So I think it's been the specter of Sochi that's allowed for all kinds of local issues here in the U.S. to just come exploding to the surface.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, and it's interesting too, because and put Sochi in context first. Obviously, gay rights is a big issue specifically because of laws that have been passed in Russia over the past couple of years, and we've spoken about that. In terms of Russian society. But do you think part of that, and I want to talk about it in terms of what's happening at Sochi, but do you think part of it is also that Sochi isn't necessarily more corrupt in those other areas than past Olympics have been, or is it also because of the nature of U.S.-Russian relations that there's more comfortability? In fact, there's almost more of a compulsion to talk about, because Russia's such a we have such a history of sort of demonizing, I guess, the Soviet Union and now Russia. I mean, what accounts for that?
Yeah, it's a comfortable coat, to be sure. I think the tough thing that listeners need to grapple with, Sam, is that the answer is yes to all those questions.
Right.
Yes, because there's conflict with Russia, it opens space for more discussion, and Russia's easy to demonize because it's something that the United States has done well for decades. That's a yes right there. yes, it's true that every Olympics has corruption. Every Olympics has kind of the crony capitalism. Every Olympics has the oppression of the most vulnerable people in society. That's true as well. But it's also true that, yes, that this Olympics is particularly bad. This Olympics is worse than all the others. They're all bad. This is worse. And it's not worse because it's covered with, magical evil Russia sprinkles or something like that. This is not difficult to figure out. It's worse because Vladimir Putin went to the International Olympic Committee and he didn't say, I want to hold the Winter Games in Moscow, or I want to hold the Winter Games in somewhere where there is snow in Russia. He said, I want to hold the Winter Games in a subtropical climate for the purposes of remaking an entire region. And that's really the original sin of all of this, of everything that we can talk about in terms of injustice in the Sochi Games, is that its starting point was about Vladimir Putin trying to use the Olympics with the IOC's full enabling as a kind of Trojan horse to go into the Caucasus, where there's been, of course, war for 20 years at the cost of several 100,000 lives, and remake the region. And that remaking of the region lent itself to massive construction projects where there was all kind of corruption. That remaking of the region also led for the need, frankly, to scapegoat people and to get attention away from the fact that this incredible amount of resources were going into this one small part of what is a massive country that has, as they keep telling us on NBC, 9 time zones, all this intensive capital development in a very small part of the country. And so what do you do then? Well, you push forward a law that scapegoats LGBT people, classic political maneuver. So all of these things playing together simultaneously, in the original sin of it really is these kinds of intra-imperial aspirations of Putin to remake this region of Russia.
And Sochi is the site or the date of a genocide of people of that area. Is that right? From about
I'm going to be actually posting an article about this in the next day. They're called the Circassian people. 9 out of 10 Circassians do not live in their ancestral home, which is the Sochi area. Sochi is actually a Circassian word that means between mountain and sea. And this is, as you said, the 150th anniversary of what's known as the Circassian Genocide. That was Tsar Nicholas II just going in there and undergoing a mass slaughter of the Circassian population. And the Circassian population has been incredibly energized around trying to say, hey, wait a minute, these Sochi Games cannot happen without any mention of the fact that we once lived there and that we do actually exist. And they started an organization called No Sochi 2014. People can find them on Twitter. And they've been going. I've been seeing these folks for a while because they've been going to the last several Olympics, dating back to Vancouver in 2010, and just trying to make connections with local activists, saying like, hey, this is happening in Sochi. Get this on your radar screen because we really want to raise the mantle of the Circassian people.
And so what happens to Sochi after, a couple of weeks go by, they start to wind down. What happens? Does this become just sort of some type of, luxury playground
Potemkin
for Russia?
Village? No. It becomes Potemkin Village. It becomes like, do you remember that last scene in Blazing Saddles where the entire western town just falls down because it's fake? This is what happens with all Olympics, is that they are building structures that have no use value unless you're holding a Winter Olympics. Now, granted, some of these structures can have more of a use value if, say, you're building them in a winter climate, because then it can be a kind of, playground for the wealthy or even, the not so wealthy, people who go skiing, people who go ice skating, like a place people can visit. But let's remember, this is a subtropical climate. They've been keeping snow in these massive freezers for months for the purposes of creating these winter games. They are not going to be doing that once the Olympics are done. So what is a skiing mountain without snow? What does that even mean? What do you even call that? So there's not going to be a lot of there. There's just going to be billions of dollars in waste. And what is particularly, I think, nerve-wracking about it for me is what is going to happen to the LGBT movement once the cameras have gone home, once everybody's gone home, once people are faced with the economic catastrophe of this. And what happens if then Putin sets his sights and says, you know why these Olympics didn't make back their money? The gays.
Right. And on some level, that's always that's the safety valve for them too, right? I mean,
Yes.
we create this controversy, and then we can scapegoat them. From the IOC's, from their perspective, like when Putin comes in and says, this is my plan to sort of create this, to spend these billions of dollars to pay off all these people and to create this sort of unsustainable new city, essentially. What are they thinking? I mean, do they not contemplate any of these issues?
No, the IOC is thinking hell to the yeah, because for the IOC, it's all about bigger is better. John Carlos, the famous 1968 Olympian, he has this line where he always says, you know why they only have the Olympics every 4 years? It's because it takes them 4 years to count the money. I mean, we don't know exactly where this money goes or how it's spent, but the bigger the Olympics, the bigger the project. That means the bigger the corporate infrastructure, the bigger the corporate branding. I mean, corporations love the Olympics because it allows them to do what I call corporate sin washing. Because there are real studies that show that if a corporation attaches itself to the Olympics, the public tends to look much more favorably on that corporation. So if you're McDonald's, if you're Dow Chemical, if you're British Petroleum, you want to be on every single athlete's uniform, or as many as possible. You want to be all over the place. And the IOC knows that the bigger the project, the more corporate money it can bring in because of the nature of the public and private partnerships that go with countries. It's basically a 50-50 split, and then cost overruns are put on the state. So you want that initial 50-50 split to be as big as possible so you can lure as many corporations as possible.
I mean, in some respects, I mean, this is and I guess this sort of brings us back to where we started, is that the Olympics are sort of the perfect metaphor for what is problematic about sports, because there's not going to be any pushback to just the whole concept of creating this unsustainable, subsidized on the backs of I guess those in Russia, but because the only way that you would hear about it would be through the media, but of course the media is just doing too well too, right? NBC is not going to say, now we're going to spend an hour on a documentary about just how bad all this is.
No, instead, oddly, NBC did a long segment on Mary Carrillo going up to Siberia, which is one of the coldest regions in the world, to look at the ice sculptures of Siberia, which would sort of be like, if you were doing the Olympics in Atlanta and you said, and now let's see what's happening in Toronto. I mean, it makes no real conceivable sense, but they're looking for these kinds of gauzy, soft stories. Because a lot of people do watch there's a tradition of people who do watch the Olympics who aren't sports fans, and they like learning about other countries and sitting around the TV, and that's all fine and good, but where is the line between telling the story of a country and then basically propagandizing for a country? And I'll say the same thing about the United States. When the United States had the 96 Olympics in Atlanta, there was this I don't know if you remember this, but remember Bill Clinton was there, and there was all this thematic bombast about the New South, 96, Atlanta, the city that's too busy to hate, and all the rest of it. And meanwhile, while they're doing literally tributes to Dr. King as part of the Olympic opening ceremonies, African Americans are being thrown out of their homes and having their public housing torn to the ground to make way for Olympic facilities. The joke in Atlanta was that the prison was the only thing that was built on time and under budget. The new prison that was built. So it's like these things are always part of how Olympics are broadcast, and it would be very nice to see a more transparent kind of coverage.